spoken here a number of years on a number of topics. Basically, for those of you who have not heard me before, I'll just give you a mini bio. My name, which you don't have in front of you, usually it's on the handout, is Howard Scherda. I graduated Harvard College, then in a degree in psychology, sociology, and cultural anthropology. Served in Korea with the Air Force. I came back from Korea, went to Columbia Graduate Business School and have a major in international trade. I had a number of jobs, but primarily I ended up with the IBM Corporation, where I worked for 30 years in marketing and management. After I retired 20-something years ago, my wife and I started a little business that took us around the country a bit, and we sort of, she got a little tired of it because most of it, the work was she had been doing, and I thought of speaking to people about different topics. And I did develop a topic which was motivational, basically, and then I've been invited back to talk about other topics over the last 16 years. So I do welcome the fact that Ann and the Towers has invited me back again tonight, and we have an interesting topic, which is really cultural changes, the major cultural change of the 20th century. There have been many, 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 many changes, and I have talks on them. For instance, one talk is about all the changes that you and I have seen over 70 years. I'm assuming that most of us are over 70 years old. If you're not, I'm sorry for you. One of the interesting things is I was at the pool today. My wife and I belong to Clinton Martin, which is right down the street, basically, in New Hyde Park. And I dawned on me that I don't see any women, girls wearing bathing caps anymore. When you were young, you were required to wear bathing caps. Now, that's not a cultural change, that's a change. But look, think about that. I have a talk about all the changes. The coal man delivering the coal on his back, the iceman coming and standing outside and maybe getting a chip so you can suck on it. The point is, during our lifetime, there have been major changes of all kinds. Most of us grew up in our early years without television. Now the kids, my God. I just saw a piece on one of the TV shows where they showed a dial phone to youngsters, and they said, "What the heck is that?" And another report that was just yesterday on the news was most households in this country do not have landlines anymore. They live only with their handheld device, whatever that may be. So those are the changes, and many, many more, and I talked about that, which is sort of nostalgic for most of us, okay? But that's not tonight's focus. The focus is on, in the major concept area is freedom. And I have a talk specifically on freedom and what that means and what it doesn't mean, because it's a very strange topic. Tonight, we're going to be talking about the major cultural change, in my view, of change in this country, which is the blacks and women in the 20th century. Because you can remember, and I can remember back 50, 60 years ago, 70 years ago, we had a different view of women and blacks. And I'll review some of those things historically with you. I just want to read briefly something about freedom, because most people don't know what freedom is. It is not a single definition. We have an idea of freedom in this country because of our basic Constitution and our Declaration of Independence and all the history that's been built up. But we have never been, freedom has never really been given to many people in this country, and we're going to discuss that when we talk about blacks and women. But the fact is that it seems a simple concept, but for us in this country, we are free to worship in our own way. move wherever we want, take whatever job for which we are qualified, get promoted according to our abilities, and give our opinions openly without fear of government reprisal. And we can vote, obviously, freely. Our Constitution guarantees these rights. But this is simplistic. Things are changing even here in a different way about freedom. And I don't want to go into it because it's a separate hour of discussion about terrorism and what that means to your freedom. Have anybody here flown recently? Or in the last 10, take off? Well, one of the advantages of being over 75 is you don't have to take off your shoes. But there's a lot of other things, x-rays, etc., right? There's social media where people willingly give up information that we used to think was very private, but they willingly give it up. We have credit card companies. We have Google. If you go onto the computer, they know who you are. They track you. They send advertisements to you. And so do people who buy lists from the credit card companies, and they target you. There's cameras everywhere. If you go to the city, if you go here, I'm sure there's cameras at all the entrances for security, but they could be used for, there's drones now, right? A woman in Chicago just complained to the police. She lived on the 26th floor of a high-rise, no other buildings around, and she said, usually I walk around naked. No one can see me, I don't bother. Well, there was a drone outside her window. She called the police. They found out that the drone was a commercial project of a developer who wanted to build something nearby. So they weren't taking her picture, but there was the drone. They are legal to do this, okay? So there's privacy issues that are unintended impacts on privacy and, in a sense, freedom, right? There are chips now being put in cars. They know where you are. There are chips in the cell phones and the iPads and where they can track you even if it's off, okay? So there's a whole discussion about freedom. Tonight, we're talking of a microcosm which has major impact in this country. It's the freedoms that we've seen, for blacks and for women. In the 21st century, which I have another talk about, we'll see other things like the gays, right? Like drugs, right? These are other freedom issues, gun control, some people hate it, most people here hate the fact that we don't have gun controls, and witness what just happened in Chicago over this past 4th of July weekend. And the fact is, in many parts of the country, as in Texas, you can openly carry. So you better be careful who you look at or say slight in any way or think they're slighted, because they can openly carry, as they showed pictures recently of people at Target in the kids department carrying weapons, multi-bullet weapons around their shoulders, and it's legal. I'm not here, that's another discussion of freedom, and that's a legitimate discussion of freedom, all right? But the fact is, we're talking tonight about blacks and women in the 20th century, because that's where the changes occurred in this country, all right? In the Revolutionary War, there were blacks fighting for the North. There were some blacks that were slaves, became free, and then became slaves again because the Supreme Court, which we won't go into at this point, ruled that they belonged still to the owners down south during the Revolutionary War, okay? I'm talking Revolutionary War. We'll talk the Civil War, the next war, because we can talk about a lot of wars, all right? The fact is that these things have happened over time that have changed our structure of how we look at each other. And the basic point I will make is things that were mentioned, which we have not honored totally in our past, but are trying to as a culture, okay? U.S. Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. When they wrote that, most of them owned slaves, but they knew the right thing was not to own slaves. But they did own slaves, and they wrote that in, and they documented that. All men, they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. These are rights just by being a human being, of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Yet, it wasn't until the next century, your century, that blacks really became free, all right? And in terms of freedom, let's put it this way. The Native Americans were put in reservations or concentration camps back in the 18th, 19th century, okay? And there are still laws that have restricted them over the years that have been loosened, okay? There are Nisai Americans during the Second World War whose fathers and mothers and sisters and brothers were in concentration camps on the West Coast, and they fought in the United States Army for freedom, and they weren't totally free, were they? There were blacks, as was the Tuskegee Airmen in the Second World War, who had to fight for to be permitted to go into combat, to fight for this country, even though in the 40s, were they free, really? They were still being hanged up through the 50s until the 60s. I served in Korea with a friend who was black. I'm from Boston. He was from New York. And he was used to a New York kind of freedom for blacks, which was certainly different than what was in Mississippi. And he got transferred to Biloxi, Mississippi, and he almost collapsed because he was freer in Korea than he was in Mississippi in 1955, okay? So freedom is somewhat something we have worked towards because of such things as the U.S. Declaration of Independence. As a matter of fact, in January 6, 1941, almost a year before we went to war, FDR made a speech, freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. Now, we still have want in this country. We have larger and larger people who are below the poverty line. And we certainly are not free from fear, are we? We just discussed security versus freedom. So there are two freedoms we really don't have as a country. And I don't know when we will ever have that because, hey, look what's happening in the Middle East. Look what's happening in Israel now. Look what's happening in Syria now. Look what's happening in Iraq now, in Yemen, Pakistan. There's a lot of things going along which impact our freedom. But we are working towards that as a country, as a culture. That's my point here. As a culture, we believe those things and hope that we can attain them. We have not, in the past, done it perfectly, but we are a country that is moving always in some direction, in that direction. We have Lincoln who said, government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Well, let's hope that's true. Then we go to August 1963, when Martin Luther King said, free at last, thank God Almighty, free at last. Now, as pointing towards how the changes have been now, during my talk, what I do is I give you my views, and then I call upon you to give your views. You may agree, you may disagree, you may think I've said things or not said things that maybe should have been highlighted, okay? But the fact is that historically, as I said, the Revolutionary War, we had blacks fighting for the United States. The first victim of the Revolutionary War was Crispus Attucks in Boston, the Boston Massacre, okay? In the Civil War, we had regiments fighting in the South from the North, okay? Freed blacks who were supposedly free, but they weren't slaves, let's put it that way, okay? The fact is, did they really get freedom from the Civil War? 600,000 Americans died in that war, and the blacks still didn't get freedom. It took legal cases, it took troops that forced integration in schools in Arkansas and so forth to do that for the blacks, all right? And what's interesting to point out, okay, is the fact that when we look at our history, our American history, look at all the blacks we look at in such a favorable light. I'll mention a few, starting with Jesse Owens back in the 1936 Olympics, who carried the American flag, and Hitler was sort of a little upset about that, right? Jack Johnson, one of the first heavyweight champions, years and years ago. But then we get, and I could mention Sugar Ray Leonard, Joe Louis, Muhammad Ali, and so many who identify as Americans. When you travel, when I used to travel, and I traveled an awful lot around the world, when I used to travel back in the 50s and 60s, people overseas didn't look at the blacks or whites or from America. They were Americans. They didn't see the color difference, just like your grandchildren don't see the color difference today, as you may have and we may have over the years. The color difference has disappeared. Sex difference has disappeared for sure. Facebook has 58 categories of sex identification. 58 definitions of sex, how you identify yourself, okay? The young people are in a different category as you, and we'll talk about that at another time. In terms of baseball, everybody reveres Hank Aaron, right? Frank Robinson. What? Jackie Robinson, but there's Frank Robinson too, okay? I attended a baseball camp, because I'm a baseball nut, back 15 years ago, and Frank Robinson was the guy that was running, okay? But Jackie Robinson for sure, revered, right? In basketball, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Wilt Chamberlain, Bill Russell, over 90% of the basketball players today are black, but people don't see it. When Jackie Robinson went out on the field for the Brooklyn Dodgers, there were a lot of people who refused to go to the park or would say terrible things to him, right? The point is today, 90% of the basketball players are black, but yet people go and cheer, that's my team. They don't say he's black, oh, there's 3 whites on the team, or there's 1 guy from Eastern Europe or whatever. They say, that's my team. That's a change from the 20th century. Major cultural change, all right? So, we have that. Well, let's look at politics for a moment. We do have a black president, right? Oh, okay. We do have we have had two black secretaries of state. That's pretty good, right? I mean, you know, it was a time in this country you couldn't be black, you couldn't be Catholic, and you couldn't be Jewish. I went to Harvard College. When Harvard College was founded, you had to convert from Judaism to Christianity in order to teach there, okay? Things have changed, okay? Now, I'm not going back to the 1600s, but I'm trying to say that the 20th century was the real change. Roe v. Wade, okay, being one for the women. But the point is that this is the cultural change that we somehow don't see the total impact about, because it's happened and you live through it and it's gradual in some respects, but there it is, okay? The fact is that these people talk about entertainment, right? Does anybody here hate Bill Cosby because he was black? You love Bill Cosby. You didn't think of him black, white, or green, right? That is the change in culture. And I'm not talking, you know, there's so many changes technologically. You know, phones that, my God, a phone, where's the wires, right? I remember getting lucky, we got a party phone when I was a kid. In other words, 1 ring was us and 2 rings was the neighbor. A lot of you people probably had to go down the hall to a payphone, as my wife said she had to do, okay? My point is, that there are all sorts of changes, but culturally, the biggest changes were the two categories of people, blacks and women, in this past century. Musicians, Louis Armstrong. You all hate Louis Armstrong, right? Cab Calloway, Nat King Cole, and currently it's what? Queen Latifah, Winston Marsalis. These are Americans now. They're not blacks. They're Americans. When you were young, they weren't even seen, okay? Blacks weren't seen. It wasn't until 1944 that the Navy commissioned a black, all right? So think about that change. Now, there's not too many blacks in the room, but what I'm saying is you should understand that's a cultural change. Sure, there's still prejudice. There's prejudice against this group and that group. That's around the world. It has nothing to do with America. It has to do with people who self-identify with a group and every other group. Look, some people take it into their own hands to kill each other wantonly, right? I mean, the Shia and the Sunni in Iraq and Syria, they don't care who you are, young, old, good, bad. They look alike. They have the same DNA. They have the same history. And they kill each other because you're a Sunni, I'm a Shia, boom, boom, boom. Beheadings, you name it, right? That's a culture. That's a cultural difference. We have all come here, for the most part, as immigrants. Either you did, your parents did, or your grandparents, for the most part. That's when they came. And somehow they bought in and assimilated into what is called America. Sure, there's still prejudices and will always be. But for the most part, I told you, I showed you, in baseball and basketball and football, people put on the uniform, you can't even tell whether they're black or white anyway. People don't care anymore. Is he good or is he bad? Is he on my side or on the other guy's side? And of course, what about all the other people who used to be reviled and ostracized, the people who were mixed marriages? All of you hate Derek Jeter, right? Well, his father's black, his mother's white. The same as Obama. His mother was white, his father was black, right? The point is that those things, all of a sudden, the distinctions have disappeared in your lifetime. There have been centuries and centuries of people living, well, not that many, because we're only 50,000 years old as human beings, okay? But there are thousands of years where those distinctions were everything. Now they've become not so everything, and in most cases, not. Sure, there are reservations about the other guy, but the fact is that's been somehow dissipated to a great extent. Now, I've based my, and I can go on to, like, somebody just died, Maya Angelou, who was respected by everybody, right? Fortunately, I've met a lot of these people. I told you Frank Robinson, I've met Maya Angelou, I've met, let me see, Cab Calloway, and Lionel Hampton, and so forth. Everybody hated Lena Horne. You know, Lena Horne, right? You all loved her, right? The fact is that in the 30s and 40s, when she was in movies, she wasn't in movies in parts of this country. They cut around her scene, and she was not in those movies. She was in the movie, but they shot around her so her scene could be eliminated in those communities where they didn't want to see it black, okay? That's during your lifetime, so you're responsible. Well, if you're responsible for that, then you're responsible for the fact that the color line has been reduced and dissipated to a great extent. Now, before I get into women, well, you know, who cares about half the population, right? But the fact is, before we get into the women's side of this discussion, does anybody have anything to say about what I've said so far?